For more than 4.5 years, the war in Ukraine has been described again and again as a grinding, static conflict. Trenches, artillery duels, villages changing hands for the cost of hundreds of lives. But something fundamental has shifted in recent weeks, and it is not happening on the front line at all. It is happening thousands of kilometers behind it, deep inside Russian territory, in places that Moscow always assumed were untouchable. The story that captures this shift most vividly is a single drone strike on an oil refinery in Omsk, a city in southwestern Siberia that sits roughly 1,500 miles from the nearest point of the front line. To put that in perspective, that is further than the distance from London to Moscow. It is further than flying from New York to Los Angeles. And yet a small, slow-moving Ukrainian drone made that journey, flying for around 12 hours at a speed of perhaps 400 or 500 kilometers an hour, threading a path through Russian airspace that had reportedly taken specialists back in Ukraine the better part of a week to plan. The route was designed, deliberately and painstakingly, to slip beneath the gaps in Russian radar coverage, to avoid known air defense positions, and to arrive at its target largely unseen. What it hit was not a random target. Omsk is home to one of Russia's largest oil refineries, a facility so far from any conceivable front that the Russian military apparently didn't think it necessary to defend it with serious air defense. That assumption has now been shattered. And this is the deeper story here. It isn't really about one drone or one refinery or one fire. It's about the collapse of a basic assumption that has underpinned Russian strategic thinking since the war began. The assumption that the rear is safe, that the war is something that happens on a map far away from Omsk, from Volgograd, from the ordinary cities of Russia's interior. That assumption no longer holds. Ukraine has demonstrated methodically that almost anywhere within roughly 2,000 miles of its border is now within reach. The drone responsible for the Omsk strike belongs to a family Ukraine calls the FP-1. It is a domestically produced organic weapon, meaning it isn't supplied by a Western government. It's built inside Ukraine by Ukrainian industry, largely under the direction of Ukraine's security service, the SBU. According to figures now circulating among military analysts, Ukraine is producing something in the region of 200 of these drones a day. Each one costs in the neighborhood of $50,000, a substantial sum for an individual to spend certainly, but almost trivial in the context of modern warfare. Compare that to the cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions that Russia fires in response, many of which cost somewhere between $5 and $10 million apiece. On one side of this equation, you have mass-produced, relatively cheap, slow-flying drones with a modest incendiary warhead of perhaps 50 to 100 kilograms. On the other side, you have exquisitely expensive interceptors trying to shoot down targets that arrive by the hundred, at low altitude, on unpredictable routes, at a fraction of the cost of the missile meant to stop them. That mismatch, cheap mass against expensive scarcity, is one of the defining stories of this stage of the war, and it is a problem that simple industrial willpower cannot easily solve, especially not for a Russian defense industrial base still largely built along Soviet-era lines, which struggles to move quickly or flexibly even under wartime pressure. It's also worth understanding the tactics behind these strikes, because they are not isolated one-off gestures. Ukrainian officials have described nights where hundreds of drones are launched simultaneously, precisely because the goal isn't for every single one to hit its target. The goal is saturation, to overwhelm Russian air defense networks so thoroughly that even if the vast majority are intercepted, a meaningful number still get through. If 80% are shot down and 20% survive, and you're launching in the hundreds, that 20% is still enough to inflict real, lasting damage. It's a numbers game, and it is one that currently favors Ukraine because they can produce these systems faster and cheaper than Russia can shoot them down or replace what they destroy. The scale of the damage being done to Russia's refining capacity is, by some estimates, striking. Reports now suggest that Ukraine's campaign of strikes on refineries has degraded somewhere around a third of Russia's total capacity to produce petrol. That is not a marginal dent. That is a wound to the fundamental machinery that keeps a modern military and a modern economy running. And the consequences are visible in the most mundane human ways. Reports from Crimea describe fuel shortages so severe that fights have broken out at petrol station forecourts. Military bloggers inside Russia, the same online commentators who have spent years cheerleading the war effort, are now openly expressing frustration and anger about fuel shortages and the failure of Russian air defenses to stop these strikes. Even more significantly, Russia has reportedly announced it will suspend exports of diesel and petrol, a step that speaks volumes. Fuel exports have long been one of the main sources of hard currency that finance the Russian war machine. Cutting them off, even temporarily, is not a sign of strength. It's an admission that domestic supply has become so strained that the country cannot afford to keep selling fuel abroad while also fighting a war and keeping its own economy moving. Alongside the FP-1 drones, Ukraine has been deploying another homegrown weapon that deserves attention, the Flamingo cruise missile. Where the FP1 is a small, cheap, mass-produced weapon meant to overwhelm through sheer numbers, the Flamingo is a heavier, more destructive system, carrying a warhead of around 1,000 kilograms, a full metric ton of explosive payload, several times larger than the FP1's. It flies at a similar speed to the FP1, but as a cruise missile it is designed to hug the terrain, staying low to avoid radar detection, following a route that makes it far harder to intercept than a traditional ballistic weapon flying a predictable arc. Ukraine has used the Flamingo to strike Volgograd, a city with deep symbolic weight in Russian history. It was known as Stalingrad during the Second World War, and reportedly succeeded in destroying a munitions factory there, inflicting significant material damage on Russia's ability to keep supplying itself with the shells and ammunition its own forces depend on. Taken together, these two systems, the small swarming FP1 and the heavier, more devastating Flamingo, represent something genuinely new in this war, an independent Ukrainian capacity to strike deep into Russian territory using weapons designed, built, and operated almost entirely by Ukraine itself. That matters enormously, both practically and symbolically. Practically, it means Ukraine isn't dependent on Western-supplied long-range systems, which have often come with political strings attached, restrictions on how far they can be used or how deep into Russian territory they can strike. Symbolically, it means Ukraine has built, essentially from a standing start in 2022, an indigenous deep strike arsenal capable of reaching targets that would have seemed like the stuff of fantasy just 2 or 3 years ago. Not military analysts, including specialists from institutes like the Royal United Services Institute in London, have been candid about this. A year ago, if someone had suggested Ukraine would be capable of hitting a refinery in Omsk, more than 1,500 miles from the front, the near universal response would have been disbelief. It simply wasn't considered plausible. It has now happened, and not as a one-off fluke, but as part of a broader, sustained campaign that has already hit numerous refineries closer to the border and is now demonstrably capable of reaching much further into Russia's interior. There's another layer to all this that's worth drawing out, and it concerns Russian air defense, and specifically where that air defense is actually concentrated. Russia does possess genuinely capable air defense systems, the S-300, the S-400, even the newer S-500, along with shorter-range systems like the Panzer. These are sophisticated, expensive pieces of equipment, but their deployment tells its own story. Increasingly, these systems have been drawn back from the front lines and concentrated around Moscow and St. Petersburg. In other words, around the two cities that matter most to the political and economic elite, the cities where Vladimir Putin's inner circle lives and works. That concentration leaves enormous swaths of the rest of the country, including economically vital regions in Siberia and along the Volga, comparatively undefended. It's a defense posture that prioritizes protecting the center of power over protecting the country as a whole, and it's a decision that is becoming increasingly visible and increasingly resented outside the two showcase capitals. Even that concentrated defense hasn't proven fully effective. There are reports that Russia scrambled some of its most advanced fighter aircraft, the Su-57, in an attempt to intercept these incoming drones. And even with a state-of-the-art fifth-generation fighter in the sky, they were unable to reliably bring them down. That is a remarkable admission of vulnerability for a country that has spent decades and enormous sums building and marketing its air defense as a point of national pride and deterrence. When your best fighter jet, hunting a slow-moving propeller drone, still can't guarantee a kill, that tells you something about how difficult this problem has become. Not because the drones are technologically extraordinary, but because there are so many of them, flying so many varied and carefully planned routes, that intercepting them all is simply not feasible with existing resources. It's also worth pausing on how these strikes are actually being planned and guided, because it isn't purely a Ukrainian domestic effort in isolation. There is a widely understood role for American and British intelligence support in helping these systems find their targets, not necessarily building the drones themselves, but contributing to the kind of targeting intelligence, satellite imagery, and situational awareness that makes it possible to plan a viable 12-hour route through contested airspace. This is an important nuance. Ukraine's drone and missile production may be domestic and independent, but the broader ecosystem that makes these strikes effective, the intelligence, the reconnaissance, potentially aspects of route planning, reflects a continued, quiet, but consequential partnership with Western intelligence services. It underscores that even as Ukraine builds greater self-sufficiency in weapons production, the war remains, in important respects, a coalition effort. Now, stepping back from the details of any single weapon system, what does all of this actually mean for the trajectory of the war? There are several threads worth pulling apart. The first is psychological and informational. Russia's system of state media and propaganda has been, by most measures, remarkably effective throughout this war at insulating the domestic population from the realities of the front line, controlling the narrative, and maintaining a sense that the war is proceeding according to plan, however slowly. That insulation depended, in large part, on physical distance, the idea that whatever was happening at the front, life in Moscow, in Omsk, in Volgograd, in the vast Russian interior, would continue largely undisturbed. Deep strikes erode that insulation in a way that no amount of propaganda can fully counter, because the evidence is visible, physical, and local. The fire at the refinery, the fuel shortage at the corner petrol station, the destroyed factory, the felt absence of a product, people relied on. When ordinary Russians in cities far from Ukraine start experiencing direct, tangible consequences of the war, not because a family member was drafted, but because they can't buy fuel, that is a different, more corrosive form of pressure on public confidence than distant casualty reports ever could be. And notably, this discontent isn't confined to opposition voices or Western commentary. It is showing up in Russian military bloggers, in Russian civilian commentary, and reportedly in Moscow's own newspapers, which have begun to ask openly whether Putin can still guarantee protection even for the capital, let alone the rest of the country. The second thread is economic. The reported destruction of a third of Russia's refining capacity, combined with the suspension of fuel exports, represents a serious blow to the financial architecture that sustains the war. Energy exports have long been the backbone of the Russian state's ability to fund its military operations, while cushioning its broader economy from the effects of sanctions. If that backbone is being systematically weakened, not through sanctions imposed from outside, but through direct physical destruction of the refining infrastructure itself, it constrains Russia's options in ways that diplomatic pressure alone has struggled to achieve over the past 4.5 years. It's one thing to be told you can't sell your oil products abroad because of sanctions. It's another thing entirely to be unable to sell them because the refineries that process them are on fire. The third thread concerns industrial capacity and innovation, and this is perhaps the most consequential long-term factor. Ukraine's ability to produce roughly 200 FP-1 drones a day, and reportedly more than 4 million drones in total across a year, against an estimated need of around 2 million, reflects a wartime economy that is mobilized with extraordinary speed and flexibility. This is a country of roughly 40 million people, essentially the entire population bound up in the war effort in one form or another, compared with a country like the United Kingdom, which maintains a professional army of around 70,000 as part of a broader conventional deterrent posture, but without anything resembling full national mobilization. When an entire nation orients itself around survival and innovation under existential pressure, the pace of technological adaptation can outstrip what more traditional peacetime postured militaries would consider possible. Russia, by contrast, is attempting to scale up its own drone and air defense production using an industrial base that is still, in important structural respects, organized along old Soviet lines. Centralized, bureaucratic, slow to adapt, not well suited to rapid, iterative innovation. There are even suggestions that Russia might resort to purchasing drones on the black market, which, if true, would be a remarkable admission that its domestic industrial capacity cannot keep pace with what it needs. This raises a fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable question for Western militaries and alliances like NATO. The kind of deep strike doctrine Ukraine has developed, cheap, mass-produced, deeply networked, intelligence-supported precision strikes against strategic infrastructure hundreds or thousands of miles behind the front line, is exactly the kind of capability that traditional NATO planning has always assumed would be necessary in a large-scale conflict. And yet it's increasingly clear that most NATO members, including the UK, do not currently possess anything close to the scale of drone production, the operational tempo, or the institutional agility that Ukraine has built out of sheer necessity. There's a real argument circulating among military commentators and analysts that the rest of the West has something significant to learn, and quickly, from watching how Ukraine's security service has organized, planned, and executed this campaign. The lesson isn't simply drones are useful. It's a much deeper lesson about the value of low-cost mass production, distributed and resilient supply chains, tight integration between intelligence services and strike planning, and a willingness to iterate rapidly on weapons design based on real battlefield feedback, rather than the slower, more bureaucratic procurement cycles that dominate most Western defense establishments. So where does all of this leave the broader trajectory of the war? There does appear to be a shift in momentum. For much of the war's history, the narrative, often accurately, emphasized Russian advantages in raw manpower, artillery volume, and the ability to grind forward slowly and absorb losses that would be politically unsustainable for most other states. But the picture emerging from this deep strike campaign, combined with what's happening along the front line itself, suggests a meaningful shift. Ukraine appears to be moving into a stronger position, not necessarily by matching Russia's mass with mass of its own, but by exploiting a fundamentally asymmetric approach. Precision, low cost, high volume, and an ability to strike where Russia is least prepared to defend. Even reports of Russia stripping air defense assets away from the front line, redirecting Pantsir systems back toward Moscow, hint at a military under strain, forced to make difficult trade-offs between protecting its forward positions and protecting its capital and elite. There are also cautiously signs that this pressure may be translating into political movement. There have been murmurings, and they should be treated as murmurings, not confirmed fact, that Putin may be more open to discussions about peace than at any point in recent memory. If true, that would represent a meaningful change from the posture Russia held even a year ago. It's worth being precise about why that shift, if it is happening, would be occurring now rather than earlier. A year ago, Russia could reasonably be described as holding the initiative, grinding forward at heavy cost, but still advancing, still able to protect its rear areas with confidence, still able to fund its war effort through unconstrained energy exports. Today, the picture looks different. Russia is absorbing sustained damage to infrastructure it once considered untouchable. Its air defenses are stretched between defending the front and defending the capital. Its fuel exports are constrained, and there are visible cracks in domestic morale, both among ordinary citizens and among the online commentators who have historically supported the war. Peace under those conditions looks very different from peace negotiated from a position of unchallenged strength. It suggests any settlement discussed now would be shaped by a Russia negotiating from a considerably weaker position than it held 12 months ago, a Russia increasingly aware that it can no longer guarantee the safety of its own rear, that its economy is being squeezed by the very war it is waging, and that its population's patience, while historically deep, is not infinite. None of this means the war is close to over, or that a ceasefire is imminent, or that Russia's fundamental resource advantages, its larger population, its stockpiles, its willingness to accept enormous casualties, have simply evaporated. Wars this large rarely turn on a single campaign, however dramatic. But what this deep strike campaign does represent is a genuine inflection point in how this war is being fought, and in how vulnerable Russia's interior has turned out to be. For years, the working assumption inside and outside Russia was that its sheer geographic size offered a kind of strategic insulation, that no matter how the front line moved, the vast Russian heartland would remain a sanctuary, untouched by the consequences of a war fought at its edges. That assumption has now been tested directly, and it has failed. Ukraine has shown that geography is no longer the shield it once was, that a slow-moving, relatively inexpensive drone, carefully routed and precisely targeted, can travel deep into what was once considered an unreachable interior and strike at the very infrastructure that keeps the war machine and the wider economy running. For a conflict that has, for so long, been described in terms of exhaustion, attrition, and grinding stalemate, this campaign offers something different. A demonstration that innovation, cost-effective mass production, and a willingness to take enormous strategic and technical risks can meaningfully alter the balance, even against an adversary with vastly greater resources on paper. Whether this translates into a durable shift in the war's overall direction, or into genuine progress toward a negotiated peace, remains to be seen. But after more than 4.5 years of war, there is, for the first time in a long while, a credible sense among those who have watched this conflict closely that the initiative may finally be moving in Ukraine's favor, and that the pressure now bearing down on Russia, economic, military, and psychological, is of a kind that Moscow has not previously had to confront in any sustained way. It's worth spending a little more time on why the economics of this campaign matter so much, because the numbers involved are genuinely staggering when set side by side. A single FP-1 drone costs somewhere in the region of $50,000 to produce. A single advanced Russian air defense interceptor, fired in the hope of bringing that drone down, can cost anywhere from $5 to $10 million. Even if a Russian battery successfully intercepts 9 out of every 10 drones fired at it in a single night, the cost of doing so purely in expended munitions could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, while the attacking side has spent a comparatively tiny fraction of that sum. This is sometimes described by defense economists as a cost-exchange ratio problem, and it's one of the most difficult problems any modern military can face, because it means that even total tactical success, shooting down the overwhelming majority of incoming threats, can still represent a strategic failure in economic terms. You cannot sustain a war of attrition where every intercepted $5 bill costs you $500 to catch. Eventually, the numbers simply don't work, no matter how large your national budget is. And Russia, despite considerable oil and gas wealth accumulated over decades, is not an economy with unlimited capacity to absorb that kind of asymmetric cost indefinitely, especially while simultaneously funding a large-scale ground war, propping up a wartime economy, and managing sanctions that have already narrowed its access to foreign capital and advanced components. There's also a broader historical pattern worth touching on, because militaries have faced versions of this problem before, even if never quite at this scale or tempo. Insurgent and irregular forces have long understood that imposing disproportionate costs on a technologically superior adversary is often more valuable than trying to match that adversary head-on. What makes Ukraine's campaign different and in some ways historically unusual, is that this isn't an insurgency improvising with limited resources against an occupying power. This is a conventional, internationally recognized state, fighting a large-scale conventional war on its own soil that has nonetheless adopted an asymmetric cost imposition strategy as a central pillar of its broader military doctrine, blending traditional territorial defense along the front line with an increasingly sophisticated deep strike capability normally associated with far larger and more resource-rich militaries. That blend is unusual, and it may end up being one of the more closely studied aspects of this war for military historians and strategists in the years ahead, precisely because it emerged out of necessity, rather than a decade of careful, well-funded doctrinal planning. It's also useful to think about what this campaign reveals about the nature of modern industrial mobilization more broadly. Ukraine's reported production figures, something in the order of 4 million drones across a year, against an estimated requirement of around 2 million, suggest an economy that has reorganized itself with startling speed around a single overriding priority. That kind of mobilization is rare in modern history. Most wars fought by industrialized nations over the past several decades have been limited wars, fought with standing professional militaries, without anything resembling the kind of total societal reorientation seen in the two world wars. Ukraine, by necessity, has moved closer to that older, more totalizing model of wartime production, in which civilian manufacturing capacity, private workshops, small engineering firms, and volunteer technical networks have all been drawn into a loosely coordinated but remarkably productive drone manufacturing ecosystem. It's a form of decentralized industrial mobilization that doesn't rely on a small number of enormous state-owned factories, but instead on a distributed network of smaller producers, each contributing components, assemblies, or entire systems, coordinated by the state, but not entirely dependent on centralized bureaucratic control for every decision. That structure turns out to be well suited to rapid iteration. When a particular drone design proves vulnerable to a new Russian jamming technique or interception method, the response can move through the system quickly, because the network isn't waiting on a single centralized approval chain to authorize every modification. Compare that with Russia's position. Despite genuine efforts to scale up drone and missile production, and despite importing components and, in some cases, entire weapon systems from partners abroad, Russia's defense industrial base remains structured in important respects around the large, centralized, state-controlled manufacturing model inherited from the Soviet era. That model has certain strengths. It can produce enormous quantities of relatively simple, standardized equipment, artillery shells being the most obvious example, but it is not well suited to the kind of rapid, flexible, iterative innovation that drone warfare increasingly rewards. This is part of why there is now serious discussion, even among Russian military commentators themselves, about the possibility of Russia needing to purchase drones from external suppliers on informal or black market channels, rather than relying entirely on domestic production. If a state with Russia's industrial history and resource base is genuinely considering sourcing drones informally from abroad, that is a meaningful signal about the limits of its current production capacity, relative to what the battlefield now demands. There's a further dimension worth exploring, which is the question of what happens to a population's psychology when a war that has always felt distant suddenly starts to feel local. For much of this conflict, life inside Russia's major cities, away from the border regions, has continued in a manner largely disconnected from the immediate realities of combat. Restaurants have stayed open, shops have remained stocked. The war has, for many ordinary Russians outside the border regions, existed primarily as something on television and state media broadcasts, carefully curated to emphasize progress, sacrifice, and eventual victory, rather than cost, disruption, or uncertainty. Deep strikes on refineries and infrastructure hundreds or thousands of miles from the front change that dynamic in a very direct, tangible way. A fuel shortage isn't an abstraction. It's a queue at a petrol station. It's a taxi driver who can't fill up his tank. It's a farmer who can't run machinery during a critical part of the growing season. These are the kinds of disruptions that bypass propaganda entirely, because they are experienced directly in daily life, regardless of what state media chooses to report or omit. And when military bloggers, figures who have, for years, been among the most consistently supportive voices for the Russian war effort within Russia's own information space, begin expressing open frustration about fuel shortages and air defense failures, that is a meaningfully different signal than criticism coming from independent journalists or Western commentary, because it suggests the erosion of confidence extends into constituencies that have historically been the war's most reliable defenders. There's also an important geographic and political dimension to where Russian air defenses are concentrated, and it's worth dwelling on the implications a little further. The decision to prioritize Moscow and St. Petersburg, effectively at the expense of the rest of the country, is not simply a technical resource allocation choice. It reflects, whether intentionally or not, a hierarchy of protection that places the political and economic elite above the broader population. In a country of Russia's size, with dozens of major cities and countless smaller towns spread across 11 time zones, no realistic amount of air defense investment could protect everywhere equally. But choosing to concentrate what does exist around the two cities most associated with political power sends an unmistakable signal about whose safety is being prioritized. Over time, that kind of visible asymmetry tends to generate resentment, particularly in a country with strong regional identities and long-standing grievances about the concentration of wealth, opportunity, and political attention in Moscow. It is not difficult to imagine how a sustained campaign of visible, physically damaging strikes against provincial cities, refineries, and factories, while the capital remains comparatively shielded, could deepen a sense in the regions that the burdens of this war are being unevenly distributed, with the periphery absorbing the costs while the center remains largely insulated. Looking ahead, there are a few plausible trajectories worth considering, each with different implications. One possibility is that Russia manages, over time, to rebuild and redistribute its air defense capacity more effectively, drawing on whatever industrial capacity it can mobilize, potentially supplemented by imports from remaining international partners, to close some of the gaps that Ukraine's deep strike campaign has exposed. If that happens, the current advantage Ukraine holds in this particular domain could narrow, though probably not disappear entirely, given the fundamental cost asymmetry involved. A second possibility is that Ukraine continues to expand and refine this campaign, pushing further into Russian territory, targeting an even wider range of economically and militarily significant infrastructure, and using the cumulative pressure, economic strain, degraded refining capacity, damaged morale, strained air defenses, to push Russia toward a genuine negotiating posture, rather than the kind of symbolic peace gestures that have occasionally surfaced throughout the war without leading anywhere substantive. A third possibility, less optimistic, is that the war continues along its familiar grinding trajectory regardless of what happens deep inside Russia, with both sides absorbing enormous costs without a clear resolution, and the deep strike campaign becoming simply one more layer of pressure within a broader stalemate rather than a decisive turning point. Which of these trajectories proves closest to reality will likely depend on factors well beyond any single week's headlines: the durability of Western intelligence and material support for Ukraine, the resilience of Russia's economy under sustained infrastructure pressure, the political calculations inside the Kremlin about how much domestic discontent can be tolerated before some kind of accommodation becomes necessary, and the extent to which Ukraine can continue to scale its own production while also defending its frontline positions against continued Russian pressure on the ground. What can be said with more confidence is that the strategic picture looks meaningfully different today than it did even a year ago. A war that has often been described in terms of stalemate and attrition now has, layered on top of it, an entirely new dimension, a contest over whose rear areas can be protected, whose economy can absorb sustained infrastructure damage, and whose industrial base can out-innovate the other under wartime pressure. On that particular contest, for now, the evidence increasingly suggests that Ukraine, against almost every expectation held just a couple of years ago, is winning. Whether that pressure proves decisive or simply another chapter in a long and grinding war will likely become clearer in the months ahead. But for now, the sense among analysts who have tracked this war closely year after year is unmistakable. The tide, however, gradually does appear to be turning. And for a population in Ukraine that has endured so much for so long, that shift, however incomplete, offers something that has been in short supply for much of this war: genuine, grounded hope that a just peace, on terms that reflect the sacrifices already made, may finally be within reach.